So I've had these two kits for a while now, as well as this plan of what to do with them. It's a Death Star trench run diorama, but it's inspired by Lego kits like this one from JK Brickworks. The simple mechanism brings so much life to the dioramas that I wanted to incorporate it into my builds. So the plan is this. First we're going to create just the floor and the wall of the Death Star trench, then add in Luke's X-Wing and Vader's TIE Advanced. We're also going to have LED filaments for Vader's blasters, and little LEDs for the torpedoes Luke's firing. And just like in the Lego example, the ships are going to float from side to side, and every time they come to the center of the diorama, that's when the LEDs are going to light up. And finally, we're going to add greeblies to the floor and walls just to make things more interesting. The first thing I need to do is put the two kits together just so I can get a better idea of their actual size, and that's going to inform how wide and long the trench has to be. And these are the dimensions I get. To get a quick win with the project, I start by painting up the TIE Advanced, and I do it much like I did in the Force Perspective video. Here though, I prime in white, and I use a bit of Tamiya panel lining to do some pre-shading. The idea of this is that when I paint on the main base color, some of these dark lines and shading will still show through. And it's going to help give it an extra bit of detail and depth. For the main base color, I mix blue into this grey and then cover the whole thing with a brush. And it takes several coats to be fully opaque. I do my best to avoid the black parts, even though I'm going to paint those over later, but I think that was probably more hassle than it was worth. And finally, for the windows, I apply black paint to the middle, and then use Tamiya panel liner to help crisp up the edges, but also give them a glossy finish. That really sells the window effect. So my initial plan for the trench was to 3D print the entire thing. And you can see the beginnings of one section here, but I quickly realized it was kind of a dumb idea. I always intended to cut out small rectangles of styrene and then glue them on for extra greeblies. And I had a whole bunch of these cheap for sale signs that I'm going to be using. So printing just a flat section of plastic seemed like a waste of time in PLA. And with my two starting sections cut out, I can better visualize how everything's going to fit, and it looks great. I slapped together a quick prototype of the mechanism that's going to help the ships move. Eventually I'm going to glue each ship to its regular nubbin stand on each of these bars, which will attach to a slightly larger bar beneath the trench. Here I'm just using paper clips, but once I'm happy with the length and how everything works, I'll switch over to brass rods. And you can see here that there's a second bar underneath that slides from side to side, and this translates movement to the bar up top. And so if you can trust me that I know how to make these things move by themselves, you can start to see how it's all going to come together. With this prototype working, I move on to print off the first section of the frame. My 3D printer isn't big enough to do the whole thing in one piece, so I'll have to glue a few sections together. But that said, all the sliding mechanics fit into this one single section, so this is the most important. So important that apparently I forgot to hit record while in FreeCAD. A little piece of it was a bit too thin as well and kind of broke while I was removing the supports, so I apply a few spot fixes to repair. With the front section, I use some skewers to add a bit of extra rigidity. It might seem a bit weird not to just 3D print the whole thing, but I'm trying to find a balance between printing out a whole bunch of plastic and then using existing materials where it works and makes sense. And especially where it's less important, like underneath here. So here, I think definitely just a piece of wood is okay, instead of printing out just a long piece of PLA that no one's going to see. These brass rods are going to replace the prototype paper clips, but they tell me how long to cut the rods. As an aside, these brass rods are horrendously expensive, so if you know like a cheaper source or a better alternative, please hit me up in the comments. And I bend the ends because this is how they're all going to fit into the sliding slots later. Next, everything's moved from the prototype slide to the real thing, and I make sure it all still moves. The rear one works great, and you can see me preparing the trench floor for the front one. The fits are tight, and the brass rods can be a pain in the ass to get in place. And that doesn't change by the end of the project either. The problem I hit though is that my repair job from earlier just wasn't good enough, and so the front slide kept jamming. Meaning I have to, unfortunately, reprint the whole thing, but that gives me a chance to reinforce weaker vertical sections. And while it's printing, I take a bit of a palette cleanser by painting up the X-Wing. I primed it in white as that's what its base color is, but if I did it again, I'd either prime it or base coat it in a slightly grey color, just so that I have room to highlight up some parts to white. Also, the white just comes across way too clean. My camera also hates white, so I might have to turn down the brightness a little bit so you can actually see the details. I keep the box handy because the box art is actually a great reference of where to paint and what colors it should be, as the instructions are just a tad unclear. And the paint job isn't very elaborate, and I'm not going to be doing everything perfect with it, but I still want it to be its best. My best wasn't the markings for Red 5 though, but from a distance, with the model moving, it's going to be good enough at this scale, and using stickers on models as opposed to decals is against the Geneva Convention. For the canopy glass, I use the same trick of black paint and Tamiya panel liner. Then we're back to frame 2.0. I like to think of these dioramas as a form of storytelling, but if you're interested in more traditional forms of storytelling, you should check out Scene 1. Scene 1 is the writing app I created to write my novels and short stories in, as no other piece of software did exactly what I needed. It has a sleek and simple interface, but has many powerful tools and features. You can even use it for free. So give Scene 1 a try today at www.scene1.app. The way to move the slides is actually really simple and only requires a crankshaft, which is just a fancy name for this long piece of metal that I bend some kinks into. With the kinks made at opposing directions, it means that the ships will always be on either side of the trench. But there isn't a reason you couldn't sync them up if that's what you wanted. The size of the kinks also dictates how far and wide the ships will move, and you could make them bigger or smaller as you needed. You'll see that as the crank rotates, the attached wires are pushed out and pulled back in on the slides. I'm also not a mechanical engineer, so there's a non-zero chance that I'm not at all using the correct terms. They work though, and that's the important thing, and corrections in the comments are just going to boost my engagement, so, help me out. This cardboard prototype also helps me figure out exactly what I'm going to need for the proper thing, and including sizing and positioning. I don't need anything so enclosed, so I just print out these tiny little crank holders. They do need to be attached to the frame for stability though, and in all my excitement I forgot to account for, a bit of width. So I have to redo them with wider bases, so there's enough room for the crank to turn. With a few adjustments it works great, but I do have to glue a few bits of scrap plastic onto the cranks so that the wires don't slide out of the kinks. And this little guy here is what I'll use to turn the crank, but it does need a way to interface with it. I have a few of these motors, and eventually my plan is to attach little gears to the front of each to, better facilitate connections in future projects. But for this one, I just take a more direct approach and just use this little bit of plastic to connect the crank and the motor together. And hey, it works. Yay for recycling. Go play! This is the point though that I print out frame 3.0. And then this is the last time, I swear. I am Captain Polition! For this frame, the crank holders are directly attached to it for extra rigidity. The other thing is that I switched the slides to be vertical. This does remove the ship's ability to rock as they move, but for this design, this proved more reliable. I also had to print a motor holder as a separate piece, but it all glues and sticks together nicely. I also picked up this little USB power supply for testing, and it's really handy because you can just dial in whatever voltage you require. It also means no faffing about with batteries and all that sort of junk. Installing the new parts goes pretty smooth, and I swap out the chunky paper clips from the prototype with just 2 regular sized paper clips twisted together. When you twist them like this, they end up acting as one single piece of metal, and it's much easier to work with. This is another example of where I could have just used more of the expensive brass rods, but using cheaper options is perfectly fine, and doesn't result in any compromises. I'll keep tuning them as I go, just so that things are a little less wobbly. But for now, everything works great, and this is the hardest part of the build all done. Prepping the electronics comes next. In total, we're going to have 2 LED filaments in front of the TIE Fighter, and then just 2 regular LEDs in front of the X-Wing. The LED filaments need to be green, so I test out what they're going to look like through a white straw, which I'd paint green. It did work, but the straw is just kind of too big for the scale. Next I just paint to me a clear green straight onto the LEDs, and it gives me exactly what I need. So I'll just use this going forward, although I'm not going to finish up painting them until right at the end. Before moving on, I also quickly add a switch and splice in a proper USB power connector that I'll just plug into a regular 5V USB power supply. The next electronics challenge is how to only activate the LEDs when each of the ships is at its furthest swing away from the crankshaft. And the solution is actually pretty simple. First I add 2 wires to the power supply and run them to their rough positions. Next, the positive cable is attached to the furthest brass rod from the frame, which is now conductive. This means that if the brass rod touches another wire, it will complete a circuit. Finally, a third piece of exposed wire is held in place across the track the brass rod runs through. It overlaps the track in such a way that as the rod's at its furthest point, it tries to push this exposed wire out of the way, and during that whole time it completes a circuit. It's another thing that can take just a little bit of tuning to get right, but once it's done, it's like incredibly simple to set up, and it's incredibly reliable. And it's also safe because it's only 5V. I replicate the same design for the front, and I use the ships to test out the exact placement of things on the trench floor. I pre-drill some holes for the brass rods that are going to hold up the LED filaments, but I won't wire them up until the end of the project. And with the front LEDs now wired up, that's 99% of the electronics done. The final stage of the build is just to create the trench itself. This is mostly made up of several large pieces of styrene, and I'll add more and more to that as I go, but I've also designed and printed a couple of custom greeblies, just to add interest. I looked at various images of the Death Star online for some inspiration, as well as looking at the bases of the Bandai 1-72 Star Wars models, as most of these come with Death Star inspired bases as well. This big thing at the front here is the exhaust port that Luke fires his torpedoes into at the end of A New Hope, and it's what our red LEDs will be popping out of. And building up the trench floor itself is actually a very simple process. I taped together the bottom layer just for rigidity, and then cut up various rectangles of styrene. When they're all glued on, they'll both help with the rigidity of things, but will also look like metal panels welded on. I have no real plans for this process, except to cover up the seams where the bottom layers join together. Some sections I layer up 2 or 3 times, but there's still a couple of patches of the base layer visible. I keep going until I'm happy, and keep in mind this is all going to come together a lot more once I put paint to it. I also keep in mind that I'm going to have to place my 3D greeblies on top of this later. It's a fun and creative part of the build, and there's no wrong answers with what you do. And it's relaxing to do with a movie on. And I turned down the camera's exposure so you can actually see through the bright white. Once all the glue's dried, I do clean up the edges and overhangs, but they don't need to be too perfect. They just don't want to draw the eye away from the models. Then I recut the holes from the base layer for the LEDs and such, and start adding the 3D printed greeblies. You may even notice that I'm reusing some discarded wires and rods, and that some of these shapes are actually 3D print supports that came out in interesting shapes. Again, there's no real plan here, I just go until I'm happy and just want to make sure there's no large bare sections. I repeat the same process with the wall, and tape in the base sections to make sure I have the right sizes. More greeblies are added, but I have to be mindful of where the ships are going to be as they swing left and right, so that nothing crashes into them. Things do get a little bit grouted, but I compensate for this by adjusting the mounting points of the ships a bit later. To paint is pretty simple, I just spray it all black from a rattle can, followed by a metallic grey spray from an angle. Shooting from an angle doesn't give perfect coverage, but it helps to give a bit of depth, and leaves what we might see as shadows. And finally, light grey, shot from above. While that's all drying fully, I paint the frame black, just to hide anything that'll be left exposed in the next few steps. One of the last little details is to turn the 2 red LEDs into Luke's torpedoes. For this, I drop a small amount of hot glue, then manipulate it until it's roughly in a tadpole-like shape. Gravity does most of the work, and I trim a few of the stringy bits off. Black cardboard covers up the front and side of the frame. I had to cut this damn stuff 3 times before realizing I had the inches line on my cutting board instead of the centimeters like a sane person. Next goes on the trench floor and wall. And I only use a little bit of tape to secure them down. I could of course use glue, but I want things to be easily accessible, just in case something inside breaks with the mechanisms. And I do a final flight test, but you're gonna have to wait till the end to see it yourself. The last big job is to finally solder in place the LED filaments. I pre-tinned the LEDs in brass rods, just to make the soldering easier, and also because the solder is the only thing holding them in place. It's a little fiddly, but we get her done. And finally, we paint the brass rods black, and paint the LEDs green. And it's time for the grand reveal. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I wouldn't be offended if you subscribed. If you like this one, you might also like my Star Wars Forced Perspective diorama that I made a few months back, and I'll link to it here. What mechanical dioramas do you think I should do next? I'm always on the hunt for cool ideas. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.